So I want to welcome you to another edition of Civility Speaks. With me, I'm Robert Sachs, and this is kind of like a carry-on from or extension of the work that I did in my book, The Path of Civility, Perfecting the Lessons of a President by Applying the Wisdom of a Buddha, which, interestingly enough, I've now gotten some comments from some other civility organizations, and one said, it's really interesting, the idea that maybe when we're looking at this issue of civility, which is not something that is new recently. I mean, what we're seeing is that probably, I imagine it's been forever, where the issue of civility and people being able to speak the truth and in order to accomplish good things on this planet have had to deal with hyperbole and political wrangling and manipulation, various ways in which people want to distort what is to their own advantage. This is kind of in keeping with the idea in the Buddhist tradition of what are called the five families of beings. And I don't know if I've ever expounded on this, but those five family of beings, one is called the cutoff family, which basically really have no interest in anything other than just getting their sort of natural things taken care of, their own impulses taken care of. And then you have what's called the uncertain family, where they're able to look up from their own gross excitement or attachment to whatever they're dealing with and realize that something else is going on and they need to understand things at a deeper level. You have the level of what's called the Sravakas, and the Sravakas are those who realize that they're suffering. Things are not as pleasant as they want. They're not getting what they want all the time, and they're beginning to discover that a lot of it has to do with their own minds. And so what they do is they decide that what they need to do is start doing a more serious inventory of what's going on. And so what they do is they retreat, they pull back. They're looking at themselves and taking care of a lot of their own individual issues. And certainly you could say is not every one of us has the capacity in the middle of our lives to really address all of the things that challenge us. And sometimes retreat, whether it be for a short period of time or a long period of time, is not necessarily a cop-out. You just need things to get settled down inside you in order for you to be able to move forward in a more balanced way. So I know that oftentimes monks and nuns and people that are reclusives tend to get a bad rap, that they're somehow copping out. And I think oftentimes a lot of what's going on is that there's a recognition that they need to attend to things which in the stimulation of everything around them they really can't. And then you have what are called Pratyeka Buddhas. Pratyeka Buddhas are those who realize that enlightenment is important, waking up is important, but they really feel like they need to do it in isolation by themselves, and they can do it by themselves. And then you have what's called the Mahayana family. And the Mahayana family is the first family where there's a step out into another dimension. And that other dimension is an awareness that deep and lasting enlightenment occurs when we help others. There is the importance of love, there is the importance of connection, and that becomes vital to the success for everyone as well as oneself. So, like I said, this kind of selflessness or altruistic perspective is not necessarily common. And therefore, even in the issue of civility, one of the important things I've stressed in terms of looking at civility is the importance of being, quote unquote, on the level, where you have either a mutual respect that is communicated in your interactions with the person, or there's at least a recognition in you that you are no greater or lesser than anyone else, and therefore you want to communicate on the level, whether the other party wants to be communicated on the level or not, okay? But civility, the importance of civility is having that kind of understanding that is very much on the level. So, what we've been looking at in the world around us are things that are nothing new. We are in the middle of a pandemic. There have been various pandemics on this planet since forever. Whenever we create an imbalance or there becomes a change in the natural environment that threatens us, that can be something that is localized or it can be general, like the one we're experiencing throughout the entire world right now. So we have that. We have various things going on with the weather and seeing what's going on with the true reality and the scientific reality of global warming. And then you have the human tendency, which I would say really comes from not every being a part of the Mahayana family. That most beings are from the cutoff to the Pratyeka Buddhas, to those who just want to be left alone and get on and have their wonderful world, or they're in the middle of suffering and they all at the same time cannot necessarily see beyond themselves. So what we have is a situation where the solutions, the conversations that people have oftentimes still have a good deal of self-interest involved, which is why the solutions aren't necessarily very long-lasting. They may be a necessary step, but at the same time, usually when there is some kind of self-advantage that comes from a solution, that inevitably will disfranchise someone, which will eventually create some kind of conundrum or conflict down the road. That's what just goes on. So today what I want to do is I want to just look at 3 different rules from the Rules of Civility that George Washington followed. And I'm going to read to you these as they were written in the Francis Hawkins books that George Washington studied, and then give you my commentary on it. So one of the rules is, show nothing to your friend that might affright him. And my commentary on this is, fright or shock of this nature has its place in the spectrum of communication. Shock value can have its place in marketing or stopping a transaction or moving it into a new direction. But it has no place in civility, especially with those who you are either friends or want to cultivate as such. Whereas civility is a process of smoothing a continuum of communication, shock or fright is disruptive and will in fact create greater uncertainty in the transactions that may follow. And you might want to consider that from the standpoint of, I remember at one point Dr. Andrew Weil said one of the first things you can do for your own mental health is stop watching the evening news. So much of what we see in the news is shocking. Whether it be what happened with respect to various people involved with child pornography, whether it is transactions of various organized crime syndicates and groups that perpetrate large mass suffering, perpetrate all sorts of evils that people have to endure, whether it be even if we want to look at, like let's say the assassination of someone we think as being evil in this world. The shock of that, the assassination or the beheading or whatever it is that we hear about, the bombing that we hear about, shocks us. And the reason why it shocks us is the fact that we are basically altruistic beings. Even the ones that are not part of the Mahayana family. The Buddha says we all have Tathagata, but we all have this basic goodness, this loving nature. And so what happens is when we hear bad news of a shocking kind, it hits us in the heart. It creates fright, anger, panic, anxiety. And how much happens to us if we decide that the last thing we want to hear in the day is the news at 11 o'clock. But also realize that now the news cycle is continuous. You know, you might get news alerts on your cell phone. And therefore, bad news can visit you anytime you want. Because very rarely, very, very rarely does it happen that good news gets more than one news cycle. Most of the time, it's the repetition again and again and again of shocking stuff that we're reminded again. And to some extent, what I would say is sometimes, like I said, this is to move things forward. And sometimes what it does after a while is it just numbs us out. And that is something we need to be aware of when we look at trying to address various kinds of injustices in society. How do we do this? And this is why we talk about the importance of civility in this. The people that are really knowledgeable of protests and confronting people in terms of hard issues know that there might be sometimes harsh words, there might be some conflicts that occur, but in the end, you've got to, at some point, move it to a point where the dialogue between you and the other side is calm, mutual, and direct. Another point, which may seem a really strange one, but here we go with this one. Shake not the head or legs, roll not the eyes, lift not one eyebrow higher than the other, wry not the mouth, and bedew no man's face with your spittle by approaching too near when you speak. Well, obviously there are some people that do want to spit in people's faces. Can't stop them from doing that. It isn't civil at any point. The other time is when you're accidentally too close and you're too excited, and that happens. We understand, hopefully the people understand that. You apologize or whatever you want. But let's look at the other aspects of this. With the exception to spitting or someone, spitting on someone, all the other mannerisms described usually show or convey a judgment on what is being conveyed in a transaction, and these judgments are usually negative or come with a conflicting emotion. So you can think about watching any of these debates that we watch in terms of presidential or all the way down in terms of how much civility or lack of civility there is in the public domain with respect to dealing with an election coming up. Yet these responses are usually habitual and or reflexive, okay? So what happens is we have our conditioned mind, okay? So when someone says something to you that is not in keeping with your values or is completely anathema to who you are, there will oftentimes be a facial expression that occurs. The question becomes, how much is that portrayed? How much are you trained to try and be more neutral in that? Like I said, these are reflexive. One does not go out of one's way to display such. Thus one could say that young George was taking a lesson from British aristocracy in being trained and or disciplined to keep a stiff upper lip. And all of the repressive mannerisms of British high society. Displaying a poker face or one that does not display any of the mannerisms above is useful in many social and political environments. However, in the extreme and as an expected norm, they can also be detrimental to the sound mental health, both for the person inhibiting and those before them who remain more in the dark as to what one may be thinking. So to some extent, it's almost like, can you? I mean, this is why people train in debate. why people train to be in public circumstances with respect to how they react to things. Okay? We will still feel it. Okay? You can still get a sense of it. There is, and what I have told people again and again is we all know what's going on. We just agree not to blow each other's cover. You can feel when there's hostility in the room. You can feel when a poker face is there and you know something else is going on. Now, if there's an opportunity to ask beyond the poker face, that may be the right thing to do. If you're completely in the dark and you don't understand what is going on, you may need to inquire more because you can feel it. So to some extent, even the civility of what is being expressed in the rules of civility, one needs to do with, in many ways, a middle way approach, okay? To try and do it with a sense of balance. In modern times, with the increased use of Botox. Now that might seem a strange, segue, but bear with me. To eliminate wrinkles, it has been noted that many reflexive facial responses are being overly inhibited via this toxin. The result is that people really don't know what you feel about things, because what's going on is an eyebrow doesn't get raised, a mouth doesn't do anything. It's just paralyzed into a certain state. Now, what's interesting about this, what they say, and this has been in psychological journals, is that the people that Botox themselves to that extent actually become more emotionally inept. Because what's happening is, as they are frozen in a particular mannerism, what happens is that the people in front of them don't know what's going on either. So you look at someone, they don't know what's going on, and therefore you can't read them, and they can't read you. So we've added another dimension to our lack of being able to really get some things done, and creating a more of an issue in terms of possibly even more of a hyperbolic response. Maybe that's what goes on in terms of the news, that when we expect all of the men and women to be so cool and so, fixed in how they appear, that the only thing they can do is shock value and shout things that are ridiculous in order to break the sort of like the frozenness that happens as a result of this chemical process that we have created that creates more of a dilemma. Now we look at two more things which I think are really important, and unfortunately this is something that we witness far too often. Show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, though he even were your enemy. If we truly believe that we are all basically good, and that we are all doing the best based on what we know, we must understand that as misguided as we may think others are in what they say or do, they think the same of us. This is the predicament of conditioned existence. In whatever conflict we face, whether it is a personal conflict or an all-out conflagration consuming a continent, to rejoice in the pain and sufferings of others shows a shallow understanding of humanity and life in general. One of the things I was reminded of when I wrote this was after the first Gulf War, where what was happening was that tanks and military vehicles were going down the streets of Albuquerque, celebrating the end of this war, this first Persian Gulf War. And people were shouting, four-letter words and everything like that about the other people, not realizing or not thinking about the 250,000 people that lost their lives. To some extent, one can be happy that the conflict is over, but it is a sign of a civilization and being a civilized human being that you show remorse that had to happen. I'm reminded also in terms of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche talked about the idea of being in a battle and actually having it that after you've had mortal combat with another, okay? This even gets into my conversation that I had a little while back on civil disobedience. That if you've ended up in a conflict, and especially in this situation, if it is to the death, then what happens is the soldier or the warrior who would have won the battle against someone would then go onto the ground and place that other warrior's head in their lap and do prayers and try and soothe them as they died. What kind of mentality do we have when we double down? When we say something harsh about someone and then we defend it by going even worse on it. And then what we do is we encourage others to laugh or mock about it. When we mock soldiers that have died in combat, what value what did they get out of it? Soldiers don't think in those terms. What is patriotism about? If someone understands patriotism, then someone understands what price soldiers pay in that situation. Was the war justified or not? That's a whole other issue. Many wars are not justified. But we ask people to do something on our behalf, and they go and do it with some sense of loyalty or faith that what they're being sent into is justified or necessary. Therefore, we should honor them for them doing what they do on our behalf. Thus, civility holds no quarters for those who seek revenge or take pleasure in the demise of others. Such an attitude can only diminish us as individuals and in the end leave us prey to the same. As the Welsh saying goes, if you plan revenge, dig 2 graves. And I would say, if you actually take delight in harming others, that harm will eventually be something that you have to deal with yourself. So the last of the rules of civility I would like to address today is kind of like a follow-up to the one that I just read you. And this point is, when you see a crime punished, you may be inwardly pleased, but always show pity to the suffering offender. So we talked about being inwardly pleased, so to speak, in terms of just, you know that something needed to be done and justice was served and hopefully the punishment fit the crime, and it was done with a sense of understanding and also the idea that the justice is given out as a way of bringing about a reformation of character rather than just being, just to punish someone for the sake of punishing someone in some kind of self-absorbed, more self-justified way. Even if it's a society, we may agree that something that is done is just wrong, and we are really glad that we can stop somebody from doing that particular thing. That can be very, very important, and it is quite often very important. But it doesn't mean that what we should do is gloat or in some ways make things harder for these people when we're hoping they will be reformed, when we hope there will be a change, when we try to make sure the society doesn't create situations, and these people do not create situations in their lives to perpetuate bad behavior. So, what we need to understand in that regard, again, is this person is a human being. We need to realize that they suffer as a result of the punishment they're experiencing. But how can we turn that suffering into something that is instructive rather than it just being a punitive experience which then harbors a sense of resentment later on? So we need to be very aware in terms of civility that when we confront people in conflicting situations, when we deal with them, that we try to do it with a sense of clarity and an openness that doesn't necessarily hide what we feel about things, but doesn't in some ways make it an exaggerated display, nor should our reaction be in terms of the quote-unquote defeat of an enemy or the correcting of someone that is has committed a crime, that what we do is we in many ways have a sense of gloating or a sense of putting them down. Okay? When we denigrate them, when we disregard their humanity, we actually destroy our own humanity. And that humanity and the morality of understanding that value of our humanity in all things is really that upon which civility is most beneficial, and civility demonstrates its power. So, I want to thank you all, and we'll continue on in another vein when again we look at Civility Speaks. This has been Robert Sachs.